Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of What's Going On. I'm your host Tom D'Ambra. As always, we're very thankful you take time from your busy day to join us. If you got to watch the show last week, folks, we were starting to discuss an event that took place recently right across the river here in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire at the George Washington Motel, and it has become to be known as Bretton Woods II. And I know this may sound boring to you, but folks, this is going to affect your life just as Bretton Woods I did back in 1944. I don't want to review the whole show from last week, but basically I would like to get into rather quickly what Bretton Woods I was all about, and who the players were and so forth, and why they put all this together. Basically, the meeting in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at which the world's most prominent socialist established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as mechanisms for eliminating gold from the world finance. The hidden agenda behind the IMF and the World Bank revealed as the building of a world socialism, the role of the Federal Reserve in bringing that about. So these are the four main things that they were looking to accomplish at this point. When they brought this into play. Now, folks, I want you to think about this, and I know we discussed this last week, but I want you to think about this. If a bunch of professional football players or entertainers or musicians or whichever were at the Bretton Woods Agreement and they had spent $250 million to put this together, and they had all the people of entertainment there, whether it be sports or whichever, do you think that would have been on every front page of the local newspapers? Absolutely. You know it would have been. So why is it that none of the local media here in northern Vermont and northern New Hampshire covered any of the Bretton Woods II agreement, when what this is the ringleader of this event was a gentleman by the name of George Soros, and we're going to get into him real quickly. But folks, you've got to ask yourself, where was the media with this? They had some of the most famous, rich, banking, international financiers of the world were all meeting secretly, supposedly secretly, at Bretton Woods George Washington Hotel in New Hampshire, and nobody of the local media here covered it. I'm not surprised by that, not one bit, but it should make you think what information are they keeping away from you. Now, the media that I pay attention to and others who view this program, folks, you were well aware that Bretton Woods II was right around the corner, all right? Because that media was paying attention to it. It was announced prior to it actually happening. And interestingly enough, the Trilateralist Commission was also meeting down in Washington, D.C. And of course, we've gotten into the Trilateralist Commission, the Bilderberg Group, and the Council on Foreign Relations before. But anyway, back on the Bretton Woods, and we're going to be real quick about it because we covered some of this last week. But the announced purposes of this organization were admirable. The World Bank was to make loans to war-torn and underdeveloped nations so they could build stronger economies. Folks, understand this is in July of 1944. World War II ended in 1945. So they were selling this to the people of the world, or particularly the United States and England, as being a benevolent cause. Okay? We're going to go ahead and we're going to collect monies and we're going to rebuild countries and get people back on their feet, get economies producing and strong again. Okay? Of course, as we got into in more detail, in 1942 at the Tehran Conference, the world was already divided post-World War II. And think about this. Why did we give so much of the world, from the Baltic to the Red Sea to Asia, to the communists? Of course, we financed Hitler, we financed the Bolshevik Revolution, we financed Pol Pot, we financed all these people, we financed communism. If you've watched other shows, we've gotten into this quite heavily, but just for the sake of time here, we can't get into that too much. But we did, and when I say we, I mean the bankers and the financial institutions of the United States, say, financed National Socialism in Germany. And if you remember who the fund manager was between the Reich Bank of Germany and the Union Bank of New York through Brown Brothers Harriman, none other than the grandfather of George W. Bush, Prescott Bush. And don't say, no, this is more wacko information, folks. We read that to you verbatim out of their own literature. Prescott Bush was the fund manager between the Union Bank of New York and the Reich Bank of Germany to finance the National Socialist movement, Nazi movement in Germany. Really incredible. And we're going to find out that George Soros also has links to collaborating with the Nazis. And the reason why I bring this up, folks, is because they have to sell these wars to you. Actually, they don't even really have to sell them too much anymore because President Obama just went into Libya without even calling one congressman. Completely unconstitutional. Where have we gone with regards to the encroachment of boundaries that the Constitution was developed to keep the government at bay so it couldn't do these kind of things? It's because, folks, as we got into other shows, we do not control anything. We do not control our money. We do not control our policy. I have to read this. I know we read this last week, but real briefly, before we get into Bretton Woods too much, let's ask ourselves, who does control our monetary policies and all the policies of what we come to know as the federal government? The Federal Reserve, now this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's website. When you go to their website, this is what you're going to read. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because of time. But again, I just want to let you know who is in charge here through their own admittance. This is from William C. Dudley, the current and 10th president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and also vice chairman of the Federal Open Market Committee. Talk about some Orwellian language, huh? Open market. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is one of the 12 Federal Reserve Banks of the United States. It is located at 33 Liberty Street in New York, New York. It is responsible for the second district of the Federal Reserve System, which encompasses, and it gets into what the district is, New York State, 12 Northern Counties, New Jersey, blah, 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 and Connecticut, and so forth. But also includes Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Anyway, the New York Fed and its president is considered first among equals. It is by far the largest, most assets, and most active by volume of the 12 regional banks. Since the founding of the Federal Reserve banking system, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in Manhattan's financial district has been the place where monetary policy of the United States is implemented. Although policy is decided in Washington, D.C. by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. Folks, this is their own face page. This isn't me telling you who's in charge, even though we've proven it many, many times on this show through law cases and through famous quotes and through Louis T. McFadden, chairman of the banking committee and so forth, and our own instruments of medium of exchange that you've come to know as a dollar. This is the Federal Reserve telling you who's in charge. All right? The Federal Reserve Manhattan's financial district has been the place where monetary policy of the United States is implemented. Although the policy is decided in Washington, D.C. by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So as I've said many times on this show, folks, all we do is elect for the dog and pony show people of an insolvent corporation. The President of the United States is not answering to you. The President of the United States is answering to the Federal Reserve banking system, which we've shown and demonstrated to you, number one, is a private, for-profit, according to Dun & Bradstreet, banking corporation. So, that's who's in charge of the policies of the United States government. It's not the dog and pony show that you see on the television, folks. It is the shadow government that is behind the scenes keeping the credit coming to the insolvent corporation that you know as the United States government. Okay, so let's get back to Bretton Woods I. We have a lot to cover here, and I know that some of you didn't see the show last week, so I just want to give you a broad perspective of what was covered. And this will be quick. The World Bank was to make loans to war-torn and undeveloped nations so they could build stronger economies. Now, folks, this is the sell. Okay? This is the sell to the people. The International Monetary Fund was to promote monetary cooperation between nations by maintaining fixed exchange rates between their currencies. It was to terminate the use of gold as the basis of international currency exchange and replace it with politically manipulated paper standard. Very interesting. Now, folks, what does this do also? And of course, we got into this more deeply last week. But this also allows the nations, let me back up so I can explain this a little bit easier. When you have a standard, at this time in 1944, an ounce of gold was set, the standard was set internationally at $35 an ounce. Of course, today it's almost $1,500 an ounce. And by the way, folks, that's not a reflection. The difference between the $35 an ounce and the difference between $1,500 an ounce is not a reflection at the value of the ounce of gold. What that is reflecting is the loss of purchasing power of the medium of exchange of the entity that you call a dollar. Now, if you've been watching this show, you know we do not have dollars. We have instruments of debt known as Federal Reserve notes. And we took out our Black's Law Dictionary, and a note was what? An acknowledgement of debt. We actually took out our law dictionary and read it verbatim to you that we do not even have money because money does not encompass instruments of debt. We have legal tender. So basically, when you had that $35 an ounce of gold, and now it's almost $1,500, what's taken place is not the value of the gold going up, but it's the purchasing power of the medium of exchange that's gone down. So when our dollar had some intrinsic value behind it, it took 35 of them to purchase that 1 ounce of gold. Now our dollar is not a dollar, it's not even money, it's legal tender, it's a Federal Reserve note. It takes more of them worthless pieces of paper to buy that same entity, which in this case is the ounce of gold. When you purchase silver and gold, what you are protecting yourself from is inflation. And inflation is not the cost of the goods going up by the value of the goods increasing. It's the devaluation of the medium of exchange. The medium of exchange is what entity is being used to purchase that product or commodity, whatever it may be. This is the difference. And if you remember that chart that we brought out about a year ago, and it showed you the purchasing power in 1913 of the American dollar to the purchasing power of what we still call the American dollar today, folks, we're down to 4%. Do you remember that? That chart was put out by the Federal Reserve Bank. That chart was put out by the Federal Reserve Bank. The purchasing power in 1913 was at 100%. When the private bank, you know, is the Federal Reserve, took control of our money system deceitfully on December 23rd, 1913, while the Congress was away. And now, well, this was last year, the purchasing power has been reduced to 4%. And this is why when you used to be able to buy a candy bar for a penny, as in penny candy, anybody my age may remember penny candy. Well, now, what does it cost you to buy the same entity? It probably cost you close to $1. And the reason why is not because the candy bar has gone up in value. Again, the medium of exchange is devalued. So at the Bretton Woods Agreement, this is when the first time that the banking conglomerations got together and said, hey, look, there's a big piece of the pie here. And we're fighting each other and getting our share, little nibbles here and here of the pie. The bigwigs, if you would, got together and said, listen, let's work together. Let's work together. Let's rob the world of its intrinsic value of gold and silver, of its real properties. And if you think you own your property, folks, go ahead and don't pay your taxes for 2 years. And you'll find out that you don't own your property. And we got into this one time. Do you have a loyal title for your property or certificate of title? You all have certificate. Bearer use of. Someone is allowing you to use that entity, whatever it may be. Okay, as in birth certificate. And if you got to see the show on that, we demonstrated to you how we bond our children through the Federal Reserve to the International Monetary Fund, and when you get to the top of the triangle, the Bank of International Settlements. This is where your labors are put forward as collateral through the birth certificate. But again, we don't want to digress today. We're going to try to stay on the Bretton Woods Agreement because it's so vital that what just took place here last week right across the river in New Hampshire, and not a word is being spoken of it in the mainstream media. So, At Bretton Woods I, they looked to consolidate their efforts. They looked to manage the currencies throughout the world. They knew the outcome of what the war was going to be. They knew the outcome of the war prior to the war starting. They manifested, funded the oppositions of the war. They gave credit to all the entities, to put all the entities not just in the fields of battle, but in the clutches of debt. And who controls the debt are these very same bankers whose representatives have just met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, just last week. And what they're planning, folks, is just the devaluation of what you know as the dollar, the collapse of it. Do you remember back in October, we read some, I don't want to use the word predictions from Lindsey Williams because he was getting this verbatim from people inside the elite circles, that basically a gallon of gasoline was going to be about $4 a gallon by the end of May. As of today, April 18th, it's $3.82. You think we're going to make $4 a barrel? Absolutely. A lot of states already have. And now Lindsey Williams, as we've spoke about before, he also in October came out about how they were going to have agent provocateurs throughout the Middle East, with uprisings, and we would have to go in to settle things. Reluctantly, of course. Well, we have. And the last one being Libya, without the President of the United States even making one phone call to any person in Congress. So, folks, don't just change the channel and say this is boring. This is going to affect your life and the lives of your children and their children. This is a long-term scenario, folks. 1944, 2011, same players, same organizations, same entities, using the same deception and the same strong arms to carry out their policies. And what we are about to witness, folks, is the same thing that was witnessed in Argentina in the 90s, implemented by the same people. Same thing that was implemented against the Weimar Republic in Germany to create the crisis, to create the void, to bring in the opportunity of National Socialism in Germany, to bring the war into World War II that was so well predicted and carried out by people in the banking finance system through understanding what Albert Pike wrote decades earlier. Yes, Albert Pike actually in the 1870s and 1880s wrote of how war would be used as a consolidation effort. World War I, World War II, and now World War III. Although if you speak to the bankers consider the Cold War as World War III, because that was all put together, folks, long before the end of World War II, the Tehran Conference, like we said. And this is what these people do, and this is what makes Bretton Woods II so important to your life. I know you're all more interested in who won the ball game last night or what Britney Spears is doing this weekend, but folks, nothing's going to affect you more than what we're about to go over. Nothing. And what they are about, what they are planning, and what they are setting up for, and which has been set up since 1970, is the collapsing of what you know as the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Now, people say, why is there a world's currency? Let's back this up just a little bit. When any nation desires to buy a barrel of oil through the OPEC agreement, which we've gone over and which we developed, and of course, if you remember, we went over that, the triangle, how we shut down and capped all of our oil reserves in Prudhoe Bay and Gull Harbor and all these other places, and then how we went to the Saudi Arabia and said, listen, we're going to make you trillionaires, we're going to protect you militarily, we're going to buy all our oil from you, we're going to force the American people to buy our oil from you, we're going to get involved in your region, we're going to protect you, as I said. But more importantly, you're going to take a percentage of your earnings and you're going to buy our treasury bonds. See? So they can keep the game going. So Saudi Arabia had everything to gain. The kings of Saudi Arabia had everything to gain. Sure, we'll do that. You're going to make us trillionaires. You're going to protect us. You're going to guarantee where our product's going, and we're going to have a market. And I got to pay you a percentage of this, everything you're setting up for me, to keep the scam over there going? Of course we're going to do that. We're going to do it without a problem. We're going to enjoy doing it. So, but where's the American people in this deal? Because I know you think a bunch of Arabs got together and decided they were going to form OPEC. Because that's what we've all been told. But when you study OPEC, you will see that people from the United States not only developed the idea, they put the whole mechanism into action. Think of this. You've been sold a bag of goods again. They've lied to you, they've deceived you again, and since that time period, you have been paying for outrageous prices of not just the gasoline. Look at the military cost of where we are in the Middle East. And what first comes to my mind is just not the cost of the money, if there was money, because as we know, we don't have money, but of the cost of blood. Folks, the bankers are profiting on your bleeding. And this is the one thing they do not want you to wake up to. So with the OPEC agreement, we get into basically this triangle of high cost for the American people, whether it's the protection of Saudi Arabia militarily, whether it's the cost of gasoline. And folks, I want you to think about this. Think of how much petroleum-based products, not only in the transportation of products, but is used in industry. How many things today are made of plastic? They're all oil-based. Think of that. Some of you people have vinyl siding on your house, all oil-based. All the plastic tools and toys and instruments of labor, all oil-based. All right? So when we get to the point of understanding that we formed OPEC, when I say we, I'm talking about American interest. The whole guise was to have an entity where we knew they could sell and finance the debt of the American government onto the American people. And this is where we are. So with Bretton Woods, #2, this world reserve currency was about the following part of the OPEC agreement. If two nations desired to buy a barrel of oil in exchange, one seller, one buyer, right in the middle you had to exchange your local currency, whether you were the buyer or the seller, in dollars to facilitate the trade. Are you with me? In other words, Spain couldn't use its pesos just to go buy a barrel of oil. Spain couldn't use its dollars, my apologies, or Mexico pesos, whatever you wish to say. Any country could not use its local currency to purchase a barrel of oil because they had, by the agreement, had to have it exchanged in dollars, so everybody maintained dollars for the reserve currency. Well, now the bankers are about to collapse that. They've devalued it down to nothing. As we said, 1913, 100% purchasing price, as of last year, down to 4%. So they've devalued it. They've extracted all the intrinsic value out of it, all the gold and silver that was backing it up. They have you paying an interest to them because they give us permission to print it in the first place. And now they're about to devalue it. And I mean, they're about to collapse it. And this is what's going on at the Bretton Woods Agreement. Okay? So the first Bretton Woods Agreement was how to get the dollar as a reserve currency, 1944, how to extract all the gold and silver and intrinsic value out of the local currencies, and also how to get the governments, by getting them outside the gold standard. See, folks, and I know we said this last week, back then an ounce of gold was $35 an ounce, and let's say you had 1 million ounces, well, you had to keep your budget at $35 million because you couldn't go beyond that. Simple math. 1 million times 35 million. You didn't have the means to go beyond that border. You had to keep your budgets within that boundary, within that window. The bankers had no control. They weren't able to put you into debt. They had no control to manage a crisis. They had no control to create a crisis because of the fact the government wasn't a separate entity. Remember, Baron Rothschild. Give me control of a nation's currency. I care not who makes its laws. Why? Because if I'm controlling the currency and the value of it and the issuance of it, I'm controlling every part of that entity, whatever it may be, government or non-governmental. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. They're controlling it. But without having the mechanism of debt, they had no leverage of credit. And this is why we work for Federal Reserve notes. Remember Dun & Bradstreet, Federal Reserve is a private foreign corporation. U.S. government, private foreign corporation. Private for-profit corporation, the United States government. We read that to you, Dun & Bradstreet. And for those of you who don't know, Dun & Bradstreet is a private corporation that lists information about other corporations. As a matter of fact, all corporations. If you're listed as a corporation, you're listed on Dun & Bradstreet. Well, Dun & Bradstreet, go on go on their site, and you will see that the United States government is a for-profit corporation and all its entities. The State Department's listed separately and so forth and so forth. Really incredible. So this is who's controlling everything, folks. It's not the representatives that you think you're electing in Washington, D.C. or locally. It's who? It's the governing board of the Federal Reserve banking system. Okay, so with Bretton Woods I, they were very successful. Were they able to usurp and confiscate all the gold and silver out of all the industrial nations' currencies? Absolutely. Out of the top 20 nations in this country, in this world that produce industrial nations, none of them, 0 of them, have gold or silver backing their currencies. Folks, were they successful with that? Were they successful with confiscating the intrinsic value of your wealth? Absolutely. Absolutely they were. Were they successful in getting all the governments to be outside the boundaries of the gold standard, the discipline of the gold standard, and get them into debt? Yes, they were. All the G20s, every one of them, are all into debt. Now, are they not just into debt? Are they all into debt to these international financiers? Absolutely, every single one of them. Folks, if you look at the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, the top 5 countries that are about to crumble, what's the one common denominator? Is it culture? No. Is it the money or the medium of exchange itself? No. What is the one common denominator? They're all indebted to the same international bankers. Argentina, Germany, it goes on and goes on. All the same international bankers. So, when we talk about Bretton Woods II, we have to understand, number one, that Bretton Woods I was very successful in 1944. And we also have to understand what is the game plan of Bretton Woods II. So let's get into that a little bit. Okay. The person who is the ringleader, if you would, for the bankers is a gentleman by name, and I use that word very loosely, George Soros. Now, we've all heard of George Soros before. And I don't have too much time to get into a little bit about the man's history, but I do want to touch on some of his history very lightly, and I also want to get into a foundation that he created. I think it was 1978 or 79, definitely late 70s. I want to say 1979, and it's called the Open Society Institute, or the OSI. And when he formed this, folks, it was done in coherence. Let me back up again. One big red flag here. Whenever you hear the word George Soros, and George Soros is an activist for this cause or this measure, or he's backing this clause, you got to understand that he is a front man for the Rothschilds banking house. Very much so. That's pretty much what got him where he is, okay? He was a Nazi collaborator. Now you're going to say, oh, come on, Tom, you're a wacko. Yeah, okay. But he was a Nazi collaborator. We're going to get into that a little bit. But he also, when he founded this, was financed through the Rothschild banking house. Okay. Now, I mentioned Ann Kluter earlier. I don't follow a lot of her stuff. As far as I'm concerned, she's just a spin master of the left and the right, keep you divided. But anyway, listen to what this comment she makes here about George Soros. Democrats have a Nazi collaborator, literally an international financier George Soros, funding their phony grassroots organizations. Let me say that again. Democrats have a Nazi collaborator, literally international financier George Soros, funding their phony grassroots. Now, folks, what is she talking about? Okay. In 1998 interview with Steve Croft, George Soros acknowledged forging documents and pretending to be a Christian to save himself from the Nazis, for which he feels no guilt or sorrow. He was 14, blah, 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 and he goes on and on and so forth. And it created no problem at all. And then they get into how the Nazis used him to confiscate from door to door the wealth of not just his Jewish friends and relatives, but Christian friends also. Folks, a lot of people think that just the Jews were incarcerated in the concentration camps in Germany and Poland. Well, when you study the documentation, you'll find out literally that roughly about 80% of the people that were incarcerated into the German concentration camps, or labor camps as they called them, were literally Roman Catholic. And I mean, think of this. What is the percentage of Poland in regards to religion? I think it's 94% is Roman Catholic. Next to Ireland, I don't think there's a stronger Roman Catholic culture than the Polish people. Now, my father-in-law was in Dachau. He was put into Auschwitz and then transferred to Dachau. And I've spoken to him numerous times about his experiences in the camps and what took place. And he basically, if you want to listen to a person who was actually there, and then you read the history of the supposed history of what happened at the concentration camps, none of it was good, number one, the facade or the reality. But number two, this perception that it was just the Jewish people that were, murdered and went through this horrific events is completely false. It's completely false. As a matter of fact, if you look at who Hitler came after first, it was the homosexuals. Then he came after the Unionists, and he really went after the Unionists, and most of them were Roman Catholic. And he did go after the Jews, okay? But the other end of this is that when you study the history, you will find out that George Soros was part of the confiscation teams. And in this interview, he openly admits it. He openly admits it, and he talks about how it was some of the most exhilarating times in his life to have the power to confiscate people's wealth while the German soldiers stood there with the barrel of a gun to make sure nobody could do anything about it. Something very much like some of the agencies of the international bankers today. And I am talking about the UN, I am talking about the IRS and others. That's right, folks. The IRS is not part of the federal government. We read this to you verbatim before. It is part of the Federal Reserve banking system. Again, don't want to do another show on it, but this is where we are. So this is the fella, George Soros, who is a front man for the Rothschild banking house that spent $250 million through his own foundation known as the Open Society Institute to bring together representatives of the banking hierarchy of the world to implement the collapsing of the United States dollar right here last week across the river in New Hampshire. Think of this. Where were the local newspapers, the local media, the local radio? Where were you? Don't tell me you didn't know of it. And if you didn't know of it, you should resign your post right now. Anyway, so let's study a little bit about this man's agenda. When you do the research and you look to see, okay, what was the goals of this Open Society Institute? And I'm not going to read all of them because there's quite a few here. Okay, but he gets into some of it political and some of it not so political. Promoting the election. Now this is in his own writing, folks. This is not me gesturing what I thought this foundation was about. This is in his own writing. Okay. Promoting the election of leftist political candidates throughout the United States. Depicting American military actions as unjust, unwarranted, and immoral. Folks, this is 1979. Boy, has that changed, huh? Promoting open borders, mass immigration into the United States, and watering down of current immigration laws. Have they been successful with that? Absolutely. Have they been successful with promoting the election of leftist political candidates in the United States? Absolutely. Promoting a dramatic expansion of social welfare programs funded by escalating taxes. Answer these questions for yourself. Have they been successful in that? What's happened in your taxes since 1979? And now there's 42 million people on the government dole in some form or another. Have they been successful? Absolutely. Promoting social welfare benefits and amnesty for illegal aliens. Folks, we're going to get into that a little bit, but study what goes on in the state of California and the cost of their hospital, of all of it. Do you know Mexican citizens are now getting SSI and Social Security benefits without putting a penny into the system? That's true. Look it up. So were they successful? Absolutely. Are illegal aliens, receiving social welfare benefits and amnesty? Absolutely. Okay? Defending the civil rights and liberties of suspected anti-American terrorists. Unbelievably so. They've been so. Folks, I could do a month's worth of shows on this right here. A month's worth of shows on this right here. Very successful. Financing and recruitment and training of future activist leaders of the political left. Can we talk about people like Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and others? Opposing the death penalty, in all circumstances. That they've been successful with, but the tide is starting to turn the other way. Promoting the socialization of medicine in the United States. Very, very successful. Promote the tenets of radical environmentalism, whose ultimate goal is not to clean the air and water, but rather the demolition of technological, industrial civilization. Very much so. Very much so. Folks, the living standards of the United States people, of the American people, have gone down dramatically. Dramatically. Bring the American foreign policy under the control of the United Nations. Let me see. President Obama, 2 weeks ago, sent our military into Libya without even calling one congressperson, without notifying the American people, and he was taking orders from the United Nations. Have they been successful in bringing the American foreign policy under the control of the United Nations? Absolutely. And not just our military, but our foreign policy as a whole. Very successful. Promote racial and ethnic preferences in academia. Very, very successful. Promoting taxpayer-funded abortion on demand. What was the very first bill President Obama signed as president of the insolvent corporation that you know as the government of the United States? What was the first bill? The very first one. Taxpayer-funded abortion, not just in the United States, my friends, throughout the world. That's right. Your tax dollars are going to murder babies throughout the world. And listen to this and read the bill yourself. Don't believe me. Look this up yourself. 60% of the funding is allotted in what continent? Africa. Think of that. First man, president of color, black man, whatever you want to call him, and his first bill that he signs as president of the United States is taxpayer-funded abortion, and 60% of the funding goes to where? The continent of Africa. So have they been successful with this? Absolutely. They got you paying for murdering innocent babies who haven't had a chance at life yet. Advocating strict gun control measures. What's happened to our gun laws since 1979? Incredible. Have they been successful with that? Very much so. And what's happened to crime in them areas when they took away the rights of you to defend yourself and carry firearms? Escalated. It makes sense. Folks, if I'm a criminal, do I want you to be armed? Absolutely not. I'm looking for prey. If I'm a criminal, I'm looking for prey. This is my mentality. I'm coming to take what you've worked for. Do I want you to be armed to defend that? Absolutely not. I want you to have no means of defending you and your family and your property. Think of it. Have they been successful with this? Absolutely. And advocating the legalization of marijuana. Well, they haven't done that yet. You know, and out of this whole list here, it's probably the only thing worthwhile. Not that I'm advocating the use of drugs, but folks, the U.S. government brings in all the heroin from Afghanistan into this country. We've gotten into that in this show before. Go to the website whatreallyhappened.com. Again, whatreallyhappened.com. And then punch in, you can click on why are our children dying in Afghanistan, and you will see Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, not only guarding the poppy fields, they're packaging the finished product. Folks, this has been on the mainstream media. Of course, they sold it to you because they have to do it, because if they don't do it, Al-Qaeda is going to get the black money funds. So we have to do it. Of course, what they don't tell you is that the Taliban outlawed the growing of poppy for 14 years, and the CIA and Mossad and MI6 and all these other agencies were losing billions of dollars in black ops money. Folks, the second place that we took control and protected when we went into Afghanistan on the false pretense of looking for some guy with 19 hijackers who orchestrated this plan of 9/11, even though it needs dialysis every 4 to 5 days, living in a cave. Come on, wake up. How much can you take? How much will you look at what's in front of you? Anyway, basically, folks, the second area that we protected was the Golden Crescent. For those of you who were in Southeast Asia or were active in the anti-Vietnam protest, you'll know about the Golden Triangle. And the Golden Triangle was an area on the border of Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, all that where it mixes there, where it was the #2 producing area of the poppy, which is made for opium and heroin and morphine in the world. Well, guess what #1 was? The #1 area. The Golden Crescent in Afghanistan. And this was the second area that we protected. And I said to all my fellow firefighters and EMS brethren, when we went into Afghanistan, I said, even here in northern Vermont, we are going to see an abundance of heroin, and it'll be a high grade. Well, that was 6, 7 years ago, folks, and I will tell you right now, my prediction is way beyond come true. Okay, so this is who, with this mindset and this activism and this financing through the Rothschilds, this is who was the ringleader, if you would, at the Bretton Woods II, which took place. So I want to read a small article to you, because I thought they did a very good job of summarizing this up. This is from the American Free Press, and it is the April 18th issue, 2011. Now, this issue was mailed out on the 8th, but anyway, internationalist billionaire George Soros is holding an international conference April 8th to 11th at the Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the noted birthplace of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, where he plans to rearrange the entire financial order. And this statement was according to the Japan Times Online in November of 2009. Think of this, November 2009. All right? This Bretton Woods II came just as the Trilateralist Commission met at the same time in Washington, D.C., with an apparent goal of creating nothing less than a new global economy. Soros is spending $50 million in New Hampshire to bring together up to 200 academia, business, and government policy leaders under his Institute for New Economic Thinking. The total cost, folks, between his fund, folks, that $50 million is his own money. That's his own money. What does he have? What is his gain for him to spend $50 million, a figure that's unimaginable to me and you. What's his gain here? Because obviously there is one to him. As American Free Press went to press on April 11th, the attendees included Paul Volcker. Now, Paul Volcker, who's Paul Volcker? Ex-Federal Reserve Chairman. Okay. Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Oh, Gordon Brown, who announced right along with Tony Blair the new coming economic order. And World Bank executive and Nobel Prize winner economist Joseph Stiglitz. The conference is slated for the Mount Washington Hotel, the site of the historic 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, which established post-World War II international finance architecture. And what did they do? What did they do? Yeah, they did all of that, but what was the result of that? They confiscated all the intrinsic value of your money system and the world for that matter. They put all of us into debt, personally, privately, and professionally. And when I mean personally, I'm talking credit cards. When I mean privately, I'm talking about the money system. And when I mean professionally, I'm talking not just outside the government, but the system itself is all based on debt. Soros chose this site because he expects his proposed reforms to be radical as those promoted by British economist John Maynard Keynes, the much-praised genius of the original Bretton Woods document. Now, we had done an entire show on Mr. Keynes, and I have to read this one quote from him, but you need to study his book. It's called The Economic Consequence of Peace. Of course, remember, everything is done through chaos, okay? The economic consequence of peace. But listen, this is a small caption of this book, and I wanted to read this to you. The best way, this is John Maynard Keynes, the best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. Now, I know we broke this down before, but folks, you think the government's yours. The government thinks you're theirs. Now, if you had to look at yourself in the mirror and be honest with yourself and see exactly who's dictating to who here, we have to agree we are the possession of the federal government and also, hence, the international bankers. Keynesian economics have been portrayed as a cure to the Western world's post-war devastation in that the governments were liberated of money creation restrictions imposed by the gold standard. Whoa, isn't this interesting? Now, what did I say last week and what have I touched on very lightly this week? Basically that, folks, when we had a gold standard, it not only set the value of the currency, it didn't have these fluctuations, but what it did was it kept the governments in discipline. They could not put themselves in debt outside of having a budget greater than what was available in intrinsic value of gold and silver. Because they were able to confiscate the gold and the silver and intrinsic value of the medium of exchange, they were able to loosen the boundaries and restrictions of a gold standard. And what I mean by that, it allowed the governments to not only grow rapidly, but to also use the instrument of a fiat currency, which brings debt. And as I said to you earlier, who is everybody indebted to on a national basis? The top G20. Very same banking entities. Okay. So it's important you understand that. Not only did it take away the standard of your medium of exchange, but it gave the government an opportunity to go outside its disciplines and its boundaries because it no longer had to sit by the discipline of a gold standard. Okay, let me start that over. Keynesian economics have been portrayed as a cure to the Western world's post-war devastation in that governments were liberated of money creation restrictions imposed by the gold standards, while global financiers controlled much of the world's gold as they do now. Folks, I read a statistic the other day that I thought really was going to be a lot higher, and it was this: that less than 1% of the American people own any form of gold and or silver. Think of that. What that tells me is that the assets of the American people are in paper assets. And what I mean by that, I'm talking stocks and bonds and the rest of it. Folks, when I purchase gold and silver, and I'm speaking third person here, it's in my hands. I don't have to worry about a broker getting his cut. I don't have to worry about what my stock is going to be today. I don't have to worry about, is it recognized throughout the world? Okay? You may want to have an understanding of, number one, the reason why gold and silver have a historic foundation of 6,000 years as a medium of exchange, and why there has never been one fiat currency to last the test of time. Not one. Not one. Folks, they are planning the destruction and collapsing of what's in your pocket. Okay. Governments under the new paradigm after the war were encouraged to promote economic growth and macroeconomic stability by creating more debt-based money. What an oxymoron. We just read to you in Black's Law Dictionary that money does not encompass debt. It's not, money is not debt. More Orwellian newspeak for you. Okay? Who were encouraged to promote economic growth. Can you have economic growth with debt? Think about what they're saying here. For everything that ailed the economy, debt has today brought the world's economies to the brink of bankruptcy. Absolutely. Now, Soros comes along as a new Keynesian to save the day by proposing another miracle solution to our problems, couched in a lofty doublespeak such as reform and cooperation and equal participation. Soros is proposing the end of sovereignty as we knew it. Okay, now here he is. Reorganizing the world order. There's no new world order, huh, folks? Cost novus auto seclorum right in the back of what you call the dollar. Reorganizing the world order will need to extend beyond the financial system, Soros writes in his piece. The world faces another stark choice between two fundamentally different forms of organization, international and state. The former, represented by the United States, is broken down, and the latter, represented by China, is on the rise. Well, he's truthful with that, but who broke down the United States? How did we go from the most prosperous nation in the history of the world to the most indebted nation in the history of the world? How did we go from a people that are so ignorant they don't understand they bond their old children with a birth certificate? That they don't understand what money is and what money's not. How? Because these very same entities are controlling your government, which is controlling your education system, your money system, your banking system, your military. Folks, it's, I try to tell people, it's not just that the dollar is going down. It's the idea that they're going to collapse this whole thing to bring in something you haven't heard of yet, even though it's been around since 1970, and that is the SDR. Now, if you watch this show, of course you know of it, because we have talked about it and demonstrated what it is, but more importantly, what it's not. The SDR is the new global currency. It's not new, like I said, 1970, but now it's being presented to you as the save-all. Special drawing right is what the acronym SDR is for. Folks, is it special for you and I? Can we draw off of it? And who's got the right? None of it is geared to us. So they are not only going to collapse this whole thing, they're going to introduce you the saving grace, which is just a global piece of paper that you're going to know as the SDR. This is where we are, folks. We talked to you about the Amero actually over a year ago. Most of you had never heard about the Amero, And at the time, we were paying foreign debts with it because nobody wanted our fiat currency that you know is the dollar anymore. So folks, I've got so much information here on this, and I'm sorry we ran out of time. We'll continue this next week. But it's important that you understand who the players are here. It's very, very important you understand who the players are, okay? And with that being said, there's a couple of things that I do want to speak with you about, and because I think these two quotes sum up a lot of what we got into today. This is a recent quote from Congressman Ron Paul, and if you don't know who Ron Paul is, I ask you to, he's one of the few that I personally have confidence in Congress. He's been battling the Federal Reserve for decades. He's a real thorn in their side, and he's exposed an awful lot of what they're about, and more particularly what they're not. But listen to Ron Paul's quote. This is about a month ago. This is, again, Congressman Ron Paul. The rest of the world will soon realize that the U.S. government is the biggest counterfeiter machine in the history of the world. The reaction will be the collapse of the dollar and a massive hyperinflation poured upon the American people. One day the people will wake up and say, why are we trusting this counterfeit machine? Really incredible statement. This gentleman was due to be the chairman of the Banking and Means Committee, right, through his seniority. But the bankers couldn't have that. They could not have Ron Paul being in charge of the Banking Committee. So they brought in another puppet. His name is Senator Backus. He's from Alabama. And I want to read this why. This summary, this statement is going to summarize to you why they chose Backus. Because don't forget, who's in charge of all of our policies, folks. We read it to you verbatim, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Here's why the Federal Reserve Board of Governors chose Senator Backus to be the chairman of the Banking Committee for the United States government. This is from the Birmingham News, and this is Senator Backus's quote directly. In Washington, the view is that the banks are to be regulated. But in my view, it is that Washington and the regulators are there to serve the banks. Enough said. Let me read it to you again. In Washington, the view is that the banks are to be regulated, but in my view, it is that Washington and the regulators are there to serve the banks. Do you wonder why they chose Senator Backus to be the chairman of the Banking Committee and not Ron Paul? Now we're going to close with a comment, and this is from 1941. It's from a gentleman of the Nazi Party, Hermann Goebbels. And if you've studied anything about what went on in Germany, this is in 1941, and I want you to listen to what he's saying. The lie can be maintained only for such a time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequence of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its power to repress dissent. For the truth is the mortal enemy of the state. The truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth becomes the greatest enemy to the state. What's he telling you? They're giving you a bag of lies and deceptions and half-truths. Let me read that again. And when you read this man's he didn't really write, for instance, he didn't actually write like a biography. This was all of his, just some interests that he had, okay? The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequence of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its power to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth becomes the greatest enemy of the state. Hermann Goebbels, Nazi collaborator and power man of the Adolf Hitler regime. Folks, with all that being said, we hope you understand the importance of what just took place across the river in New Hampshire. We ask you to do your own research on Bretton Woods II. Please look it up on the internet, Bretton Woods II. And if you want to understand what's a carryover from, obviously, study the Bretton Woods Conference in July of 1944. As always, folks, we are very, very appreciative that you take time from your busy day to watch this program. We hope you found it worthwhile. And as always, we remind you that your government is your responsibility. Thank you for watching.